The forge had always been a sanctuary for Arlen Hayes, a place where the rhythm of his hammer against iron drowned out the noise of a world that had tried to break him. The faint glow of embers now illuminated his weathered hands, hands that had built and rebuilt this life, one heavy blow at a time. Outside, the town rested under Forge's iron grip, its towering smokestacks casting long, ominous shadows over homes and lives alike. Arlen was no stranger to those shadows. They had haunted him for years, ever since the factory collapse that claimed dozens of lives and left him a pariah. His protests and pleas for safety reforms had earned him the blame instead. Forge needed a scapegoat, and Arlen Hayes, young, black, and outspoken, was the perfect candidate. The weight of that injustice still pressed down on him, a silent reminder of a battle lost and the cost of defiance. The leaflet sitting on his workbench was another reminder, though this one carried the sharp defiance of youth. Leah's words were printed in bold, defiant letters. Take back your future. Stop living in fear. She had slipped it into his hand that morning, her fiery gaze daring him to argue. But Arlen didn't need to argue. He recognized the fire in her eyes. It mirrored the one he had once carried, before Forge extinguished it. Leah didn't understand the cost of fighting back, not yet. Arlen wanted to protect her from that knowledge, though the weight of the leaflet told him it might already be too late. The sound of gravel crunching under heavy boots broke through the forge's stillness. Arlen's chest tightened, his instincts sharpened by years of navigating tension with men who believed power gave them ownership of everything and everyone. Two figures appeared at the doorway, their forged uniforms cutting through the dim light. Arlen didn't look up at first, focusing on the embered iron in his hands as if it still held the answers to battles long fought and lost. One of the men, tall and thick-necked, stepped closer. His movements were slow and deliberate, a predator sizing up its prey. "We've been hearing some interesting things, Hayes," he said, his voice oozing with mock concern. Arlen stayed silent, placing the iron down carefully on the anvil. His broad shoulders straightened as he turned to face them. He didn't need words, his silence was answer enough. The second man, wiry and sharp-featured, smirked as he glanced at the leaflet on the workbench. "Looks like someone's been busy," he muttered. His gaze shifted to Arlen, his smirk hardening. "Word of advice, don't let that kid of yours get too carried away. Could be dangerous." Arlen's fists clenched, the scars on his knuckles catching the light. He didn't need a lecture on danger. He had lived it, carried it, and worn it like a second skin. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a warning. The two men lingered a moment longer, their presence a calculated threat. Then, satisfied with the message they had delivered, they turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind the heavy scent of oil and arrogance. Inside the forge, the air hung thick with unspoken words and the sharp sting of memories. Arlen returned to his bench, his hands trembling as he folded the leaflet. He had fought this battle before, and it had cost him everything. Yet, Leah's fire reminded him that the fight wasn't over. Forge's grip on the town might be ironclad, but iron could bend. It could break. Miles away, in a polished office overlooking the town, Victor Armitage leaned back in his leather chair, the faint glow of the factory lights reflecting off the glass. A copy of Leah's leaflet lay on his desk, its bold letters an affront to his carefully cultivated empire. Armitage's fingers drummed against the wood, his sharp blue eyes scanning the words with a mix of amusement and disdain. "She's got guts," he muttered, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Too bad guts don't pay the bills." His assistant, a younger man with a nervous energy, hovered nearby. "Do you want me to handle it?" Armitage waved a dismissive hand. "Not yet. Let her play her little game. But keep an eye on them. If Hayes thinks he can rise from the ashes, we'll remind him just how flammable his life still is." Back at the forge, Leah watched from the shadows as Arlen stared at the folded leaflet in his hands. She wanted to step forward, to remind him that silence was complicity, but something in his posture held her back. Arlen's broad frame seemed heavier than usual, weighed down by a history she could only guess at. He had told her stories of the factory collapse, of the strikes and the union meetings, but the pain in his voice always stopped him before the story reached its end. Leah knew the end. Everyone in town did. Arlen Hayes had tried to stand against Forger and failed, and the town had paid the price. Houses left to rot, streets falling apart, and a community too scared to fight back. Leah refused to accept that this was all life had to offer. The town deserved better. They all did. Inside the forge, Arlen's mind raced. He could feel the storm brewing, the same way he had felt it all those years ago. The town was restless, the workers on edge, and Forge COR's patience was thinning. He wanted to believe that things could be different this time, that Leah's fire wouldn't consume her the way his had consumed him. But deep down, he knew the truth. Battles like this always left scars, and not everyone made it out unscathed. As the forge's embers dimmed, Arlen placed the folded leaflet in his pocket. He didn't have answers, only questions that burned as fiercely as the fire that once roared in his chest. Outside, the town lay silent, but Arlen could feel the weight of every life Forger had crushed. His daughter's fire might reignite the town's hope, but it could just as easily bring the full force of Forge COR's wrath to their doorstep. And this time, there might be no rebuilding. The silence of the workshop was deceptive. Whispers of rebellion had begun to ripple through the town, each one carrying Leah's words like embers searching for kindling. The leaflets she had distributed found their way into the hands of workers, passed quietly in factories, and shared in the dark corners of the market. What started as murmurs of hope now edged toward open defiance. One by one, the workers began seeking out Arlen. They arrived under the cover of anonymity, their faces drawn with exhaustion but lit by a flicker of something Arlen hadn't seen in years: determination. "We need your help," they said, their voices barely above a whisper. "You've been through this. You know how to fight them." But Arlen shook his head every time. "You don't understand," he would reply, his tone firm but heavy. "They don't play fair. This isn't a fight you win. It's one you survive." The workers left his forge with disappointment etched into their faces, but Arlen wasn't swayed. He had seen what Forger could do. He had lived it. And he had no intention of letting Leah or anyone else make the same mistakes. But Forger wasn't content to let the whispers grow unchecked. Arlen began to notice men he didn't recognize lingering near the forge. They loitered at the edge of the market, their sharp eyes following Leah when she passed by. A black sedan idled just long enough outside the workshop to make its presence felt. These weren't coincidences. Forger was watching, waiting, and the message was clear: any spark of defiance would be snuffed out before it could ignite. Arlen's unease grew into action. He began teaching Leah the basics of self-defense in the evenings, their hands moving in rhythm as they practiced simple but effective maneuvers. She resisted at first, her fiery spirit bristling at his caution. "You can't fight this, Leah," he told her, his voice firm but pleading. "At least not like this. Let it go before it's too late." But Leah's defiance burned brighter. "Let it go? That's what you did, isn't it?" she said, her words cutting deeper than she intended. "And look where we are." Arlen didn't respond. He couldn't. Her words had hit their mark, opening a wound he had tried to ignore for years. Forger's response came soon after, not with words but with violence wrapped in the guise of misfortune. Caleb, a young man who worked the loading docks, was among the first to whisper of resistance. It was Caleb who had taken a stack of Leah's leaflets to the market that morning. By midday, he was lying on the ground, clutching his leg as a crate collapsed from an unsecured cart. The injury wasn't fatal, but it was enough to leave Caleb unable to work for weeks. The message was unmistakable: Forger saw everything, and no one was untouchable. Arlen heard about the incident from one of the dock workers who passed by his forge. The man's voice trembled as he recounted the details, his eyes darting nervously toward the street. "They're sending a warning, Arlen. They know about the leaflets." The weight of it pressed down on Arlen's chest. He stared at the hammer in his hand, its familiar heft a poor comfort against the storm brewing around him. He didn't need warnings to understand what was coming. The tension reached a boiling point during the town's annual gathering, a public event designed to present an illusion of harmony under Forge COR's rule. Victor Armitage stood on the stage, his polished smile masking the iron grip he held over the town. Arlen watched from the crowd, his fists clenched as Armitage delivered his carefully rehearsed speech. "This town thrives on hard work and unity," Armitage said, his voice smooth as oil. It's why we've succeeded together. But let me remind you, success comes from knowing your place and staying in it. Arlen couldn't stay silent. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Unity? Is that what you call it when your workers are injured and too afraid to speak out? The crowd fell silent. All eyes turned to Arlen, and for a moment, the weight of their shared anger seemed to shift. But Armitage didn't falter. He met Arlen's gaze with a cold, calculated smirk. Ah, Arlen Hayes, Armitage said, drawing out the name like a taunt. The man who knows all about failure, don't you? You stood up before, and what did it get you? A ruined life and a town left worse off than before. The words stung, but Arlen refused to flinch. He held his ground, even as the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Armitage's power wasn't in his words, it was in the fear he wielded. And fear was a hard habit to break. The gathering ended with a heavy silence, and Arlen returned to his forge, his thoughts a tangled knot of anger and regret. He couldn't deny the truth in Armitage's words. His past failures loomed large, casting doubt over every step he took now. As he reached the door of his workshop, something caught his eye. A folded piece of paper was tucked beneath the handle. Arlen glanced around, but the street was empty. He unfolded the note with cautious hands. Your fight isn't over. They haven't won yet. The words were simple, but they struck like a hammer blow. Someone else believed in the fight, believed that Forge COR's grip could be broken. Arlen's hand tightened around the note as his resolve wavered between caution and something deeper. He stared at the forge's darkened interior, the tools and embers waiting in silence. The past was a heavy burden, but the note reminded him that the future wasn't yet written. Forger had delivered its first blow, but the fight was far from over. The air around the forge was tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Whispers of Forge COR's tightening grip spread through the town, but the seeds of resistance were also taking root. Arlen's resolve, though still wavering, began to harden with each passing challenge. As he worked, the sound of hammers and the heat of the flames became a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts. The fight, whether he wanted it or not, had found him again. The knock at his door was sharp and impatient. Wiping his hands on his apron, Arlen opened it to find a woman with piercing green eyes and a restless energy that made the room seem smaller. Arlen Hayes? She asked, stepping inside before he could answer. Selena Quinn, investigative journalist. I think we need to talk. Arlen stared at her, taken aback by her directness. She set a thick envelope on his workbench, its edges worn from handling. That's everything I've got on Forge CO. Land grabs, forged deeds, bribed officials. They've been buying out, or burning out, anyone in their way. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the envelope. Why bring this to me? Because you're the only one with enough grit to do something about it, Selena replied. I've been following your story. You may not see it, but people look up to you. They're waiting for you to act. Arlen looked away, the weight of her words pressing on him. His failures still loomed large, but Selena's determination was contagious. He picked up the envelope, thumbing through the papers. Maps, photos, receipts, it was all there, a damning trail leading straight to Forge COR's doorstep. Selena leaned closer, her voice dropping. They think they're untouchable. But with the right push, their empire could crumble. We just need someone willing to light the match. Arlen nodded slowly. If this gets out, it won't just be me they come after. That's the point, isn't it? Selena said with a wry smile. You're not in this alone. While Selena's visit planted the first seeds of strategy, Leah was already taking action. Against her father's wishes, she gathered a small group of like-minded youth, teenagers and young workers whose frustrations mirrored her own. They met in secret, using abandoned buildings and quiet corners to plan their moves. Their efforts were small but effective, leaflets plastered on Forge COR buildings, graffiti slogans that read "This town belongs to us," and the occasional power outage in Forge COR facilities. The group's defiance was a flicker of light in the oppressive shadow, and for Leah, it was a way to channel her anger into purpose. Arlen found out about her activities when one of the boys, no older than 16, arrived at the forge with a bruised cheek and a defiant glare. Leah said you'd know what to do, he said, clutching his side as he winced. Arlen's face darkened. What happened? Forgeseer caught me near their storage yard, the boy replied. They didn't like the spray paint. Leah entered the room moments later, her arms crossed as if daring her father to lecture her. Arlen didn't. Instead, he gestured for the boy to sit while he fetched a first aid kit. As he cleaned the wound, he glanced at Leah. You've been busy. She didn't flinch. Someone has to be. He sighed, setting down the bandages. If you're going to do this, you need to be smart about it. Careless rebellion only gives them more power. Her eyes widened in surprise. You helping? I'm teaching, he corrected. There's a difference. Word spread quickly among the young workers and the older generation. Soon, Arlen's forge became more than just a workshop. It was a sanctuary and a training ground. He taught them what he could, how to stay unnoticed, how to defend themselves, and how to plan without leaving traces. The older workers, initially skeptical, began to drift in, their respect for Arlen rekindled as they watched his dedication. But Forgeseer didn't stay idle. They escalated their efforts, proving that their reach extended into every corner of the town. The message came in fire and smoke. Jonas Carter, a longtime friend of Arlen's and a skilled carpenter, lost his workshop to a mysterious blaze. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the building was little more than charred wood and ash. Jonas stood among the wreckage, his face streaked with soot and despair. Arlen found him there, staring at the ruins of his livelihood. They'll stop at nothing, Jonas said, his voice hollow. If they can do this to me, what's stopping them from coming for you? Nothing, Arlen replied, his jaw tightening. And that's why we have to stop them first. The fire was a turning point. Arlen gathered the workers that evening, their faces lit by the glow of lanterns and the forge's embers. For years, he had avoided leadership, fearing the cost of failure. But now, with Forgeseer's actions threatening everyone he cared about, he couldn't stand by any longer. I won't lie to you, he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. This isn't going to be easy. They have money, power, and no conscience. But they don't have us. If we stand together, if we fight smart, we can take back what's ours. The room was silent, every face turned toward him. He could see their doubts, their fears, but also their hope. We've all lost something to Forgeseer, he continued. Our homes, our businesses, our peace. They think they own this town. It's time to show them they're wrong. One by one, heads nodded. The room filled with quiet murmurs of agreement, the sound of resolve hardening into action. For the first time in years, Arlen felt the stirrings of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all of them. And this time, he wouldn't let fear dictate his choices. The battle wasn't over, but the first real move had been made. Forgeseer had delivered their blow, but the town had answered with a promise. They would not go quietly. Leah's heart raced as the screen illuminated the darkened room. Lines of code scrolled endlessly, her fingers dancing over the keyboard with precision and urgency. Around her, the room buzzed with muted anticipation. She and her team, a group of determined young workers, had worked for weeks to infiltrate Forgeseer's surveillance network. Each click of the keys brought them closer to the truth hidden behind the corporation's walls. The footage finally loaded. The room stilled. On the screen, barrels marked with hazardous symbols were discreetly transported through the plant's backlit. Workers in protective gear handled them carelessly, dumping their contents into a nearby stream. The dark liquid spread through the water, staining it with an oily sheen. The image burned into Leah's mind, a visual representation of the damage her town had endured for years. She sat back, breath shallow. The proof was there, undeniable and damning. Forgeseer wasn't just polluting the land, they were poisoning her community. The group didn't speak, their silence a shared understanding of the weight of what they had uncovered. Leah closed her laptop with resolve, the plan already forming in her mind. By morning, the video was everywhere. Social media feeds, news outlets, and even local broadcasts picked up the footage. Forgeseer's crimes were exposed, the evidence impossible to ignore. The town buzzed with whispers of rebellion, their anger palpable and growing. Yet this newfound attention also put Leah and her group at risk. They knew Forgeseer's retaliation would come swiftly and ruthlessly. Victor Kane stood in his office, watching the news coverage with a blank expression that masked the storm brewing beneath. His empire, built on a facade of progress and innovation, was under siege. The footage had gone viral, casting his company as the villain poisoning the town. It wasn't just an attack on his reputation, it was a declaration of war. Orders were issued. Security was tightened at every entry point of the plant. Patrols doubled, guards armed, and surveillance became suffocating. Victor's message was clear: Fortune would not bow to public scrutiny or rebellion. Employees were questioned, their movements monitored. The town, already divided, felt the growing tension seep into its streets. Leah continued her work in secret, her group taking every precaution to remain anonymous. Their victory was fleeting, the price of exposure was heavier than they had anticipated. Victor's paranoia expanded beyond the plant, extending his reach into the lives of those he suspected were involved. Yet Leah pressed on, determined to use the momentum they had built. Then came the explosion. The storage shed on Forgecor's property erupted in flames, the blast lighting up the night sky. Forgecor wasted no time framing the incident as an act of domestic terrorism. Local authorities moved quickly, fueled by vague evidence and well-placed accusations. Arlen Hayes became the scapegoat. His arrest sent shockwaves through the town, a stark reminder of the lengths Forgecor would go to maintain control. Arlen sat alone in the holding cell, the cold metal bench pressing against his back. The accusations were a familiar wound, reopening memories of his past failure. He had fought to protect his people once before and lost everything. Now, that same fight had dragged him into the spotlight again. His thoughts raced, not with fear but with resolve. Forgecor wanted him silent, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Selena Quinn arrived at the station with stacks of documents and irrefutable evidence. Her investigation exposed Forgecor's fabricated claims, linking their narrative to corrupt officials and Victor Kane's influence. The authorities had no choice but to release Arlen. As he stepped out of the station, he was met with a wave of supporters. Their cheers were not for a man freed but for a movement reignited. The protest followed. Hundreds gathered at Forgecor's gates, their collective anger reverberating through the air. Workers and residents stood side by side, holding signs that demanded justice. Environmental activists joined them, their voices amplifying the outcry. The sight was both a testament to their unity and a challenge to Forgecor's dominance. Victor observed from his office, his expression unreadable. The crowd outside was larger than he had expected, their defiance louder. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with contingency plans. He refused to let this setback disrupt his empire. His orders were sharp and uncompromising: escalate security, root out the leaders, and crush the movement. Arlen watched the crowd, his chest tightening with equal parts pride and fear. The people were standing together, their strength undeniable. But he knew Forgecor's response wouldn't stop at intimidation. Their retaliation would be brutal and relentless. Leah remained hidden, coordinating with her group in secret. The fear of being discovered loomed over them, yet they pressed forward. They knew their actions had sparked something powerful, but the fire they had ignited was unpredictable. Victor Kane, standing in the shadows of his crumbling empire, prepared his next move. He wasn't just fighting to maintain control, he was fighting to destroy anyone who dared to challenge him. The crowd surged against the metal barricades, their collective anger a storm waiting to break. Faces, weathered by years of hardship, bore a determination that could no longer be ignored. Banners waved high, slogans scrawled in defiance against Forgecor's oppressive hold on their town. At first, the protest was a roar of unity, chants and demands filling the air, a chorus of voices against a single enemy. But as the hours dragged on, tension thickened like smoke, and the balance teetered dangerously. Forgecor's security forces, clad in dark uniforms, formed an imposing wall at the gates. Their blank visors reflected the crowd, creating a divide that seemed insurmountable. It was an image meant to intimidate, and for many, it did. A warning shot was fired, not from a weapon but from Forgecor's show of dominance. When the first protester pushed too close to the barricade, the response was swift and merciless. A baton strike that sent him sprawling. The air cracked with the sound of panic. The crowd shifted, some stepping back while others surged forward. A single spark ignited chaos. Protesters clashed with security, fists meeting shields, bodies colliding in a flurry of desperation and fury. A makeshift sign became a weapon, its wooden pole cracking against the reinforced armor of a guard. Tear gas canisters hissed as they hit the ground, spilling noxious clouds that forced many to retreat, coughing and shielding their faces. Leah was in the thick of it, her voice hoarse from shouting, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. A sudden rush of movement pushed her off balance. She turned just in time to see a guard's baton swing downward. Pain exploded in her shoulder as she crumpled to the ground. Her vision blurred, but she saw familiar hands pulling her to safety. Caleb's voice was frantic, shouting her name as he dragged her out of harm's way. Blood trickled from a cut above her eye, but her focus remained on the crowd. Even through the haze of pain, her thoughts burned with anger. When the dust settled, the scene was a grim tableau. Arrests were swift and brutal. Those who had fought back were dragged to waiting vans, their faces streaked with sweat and defiance. Others nursed injuries, retreating to regroup but not to surrender. The protest had turned into a battlefield, and while the crowd hadn't been silenced, the cost was undeniable. At home, Caleb's frustration boiled over. He stood in the kitchen, pacing like a caged animal, his anger spilling into every word. This is what you wanted, isn't it? Chaos and bloodshed? You're no better than they are, dragging her into this. His finger jabbed toward Arlen, his voice sharp with accusation. Arlen remained seated, his expression impassive but his hands clenched into fists. He absorbed Caleb's words like blows, each one striking at his deepest fears. Leah sat nearby, her arm in a makeshift sling, her face pale but resolute. She wanted to speak, to defend her father, but the room's tension was suffocating. You think I don't see it? Caleb continued, his voice rising. They'll push harder now. More hours, fewer breaks, no safety. People can't keep up. We're going to lose everything, our jobs, our homes, her. He stopped, his voice cracking as he glanced at Leah. The words hung heavy in the room. Arlen looked at his son, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. You think I wanted this? He finally said, his voice low but steady. Do you think I enjoy seeing her hurt, seeing this town ripped apart? I don't have all the answers, Caleb, but I know we can't keep letting them win. If we do, there'll be nothing left worth fighting for. Caleb turned away, running a hand through his hair, the fight draining out of him. He didn't respond, but the silence spoke volumes. Across town, Victor Kane sat in his office, his calm exterior hiding the venom boiling beneath. The footage of the protest played on a loop, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he watched the crowd scatter under ForgeCor's iron fist. He saw not chaos but opportunity. His voice was measured as he addressed his team, issuing orders with surgical precision. Hours were extended. Safety measures were stripped away under the guise of cost-cutting. The message was clear. ForgeCor's grip would only tighten, and resistance would be met with unrelenting force. Workers filed into the plant with their heads down, their fear palpable. The protest had emboldened some, but for others, it was a reminder of the consequences of defiance. Amidst the growing unrest, Arlen received an unexpected visitor. Elliot Marsh, a former ForgeCor employee with a nervous demeanor, arrived at the workshop late in the evening. His hands trembled as he laid a folder on the table, his eyes darting to the windows as though he were being watched. I shouldn't be here, he whispered, his voice barely audible. But you need to see this. Arlen opened the folder, his breath catching as he scanned the documents. They detailed ForgeCor's plans to shut down the plant and sell the land, leaving the town to wither without its primary source of employment. It wasn't just about profit. It was a calculated move to dismantle the community entirely. Elliot's voice broke the silence. They don't care about us. We're expendable, just numbers on a ledger. But you have people who'll listen to you. They need to know what's coming. Arlen's mind raced. The revelation was a double-edged sword. The townspeople had rallied behind the hope of change, but this news could shatter that unity. He imagined the fear and anger that would spread once the truth came out. Yet, he also saw an opportunity, a chance to galvanize the town with the promise of something greater than survival. The weight of the decision pressed on him as he looked at Elliot. "Thank you for this. You've done the right thing, even if it doesn't feel like it." Elliot nodded, his expression a mix of relief and dread. "Just be careful. They'll come for anyone who stands in their way." As Arlen shared the news with his closest allies, the response was divided. Some were ready to fight harder, their anger reignited by Forge-Cor's betrayal. Others hesitated, fear creeping into their resolve. The possibility of losing their jobs, their livelihoods, was too great a risk for many. The workshop became a microcosm of the town's struggle, the arguments echoing the broader division within the community. Arlen stood amidst the clamor, his voice rising above the chaos. "We have a choice," he said, his tone firm but impassioned. "We can let them tear us apart, or we can stand together. This isn't just about keeping our jobs. It's about protecting our future, our families, and our dignity. If we back down now, we'll lose everything, piece by piece." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Leah, despite her injury, stepped forward, her voice steady. "He's right. If we don't fight, they'll keep taking until there's nothing left. This is our home, and we're the only ones who can save it." The group began to nod, their resolve returning. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. The meeting room, dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, buzzed with quiet but tense voices. Arlen stood at the head of the table, his weathered hands gripping its edge as he listened to the escalating argument. What had started as a united front was now fracturing under the pressure. The faces around him mirrored the battle raging within the group, fear against resolve, hope against despair. "We can't keep this up," one of the older workers said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Do you think Forge-Cor will stop at intimidation? They'll come for us, for our families. I can't risk that." "Risk?" Leah's voice cut through the air like a blade. She stepped forward, her injured arms still in a sling. "Every day we do nothing, we risk losing everything. They've poisoned our water, taken our jobs, and beaten us down. If we give up now, what's left? A slow death." Her defiance stirred murmurs of agreement, but it was clear the room was divided. Arlen watched as the group splintered before his eyes. These were people he had known for years, some for decades. Their loyalty was unwavering, but their fear was just as strong. He knew what was at stake for each of them: children to feed, mortgages to pay, futures hanging by a thread. As the arguments raged on, Leah approached her father, her voice low enough not to draw attention. "We can't afford to wait for them to make up their minds. I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." His eyes narrowed. "What are you planning?" "Forge-Cor's newest machinery. It's faulty and dangerous. If we can shut it down, even temporarily, it'll force them to slow production. It's a calculated risk." Arlen's stomach tightened. He knew her determination well. It was a mirror of his own from years past. "This isn't a game, Leah. One mistake and they'll crush you." She met his gaze, unwavering. "We don't have a choice." That night, Leah and her small group moved under the cover of darkness. The factory loomed like a beast against the horizon, its floodlights casting long, menacing shadows. They slipped past the outer fences, their footsteps muffled against the gravel. Leah's heart pounded as they approached the maintenance area. The plan was simple: disable the equipment and get out before anyone noticed. But simplicity was no shield against betrayal. Just as they reached their target, the roar of engines shattered the silence. Bright beams of light swept across the group, and shouts erupted from the guards. Panic set in as Leah barked orders to scatter, but the guards were relentless. One by one, her team was cornered and subdued, their defiance met with brutality. Leah herself barely escaped, her breaths ragged as she hid beneath a storage container. Her heart sank as she watched her friends dragged away, their faces bloodied but defiant. She clenched her fists, tears streaming down her face. The mission had failed, and now the price would be paid. The following day, the local paper carried a headline that should have been a triumph: Forge-Cor exposed, illegal activities revealed. Selena Quinn's investigation had been thorough, her evidence damning. But Forger struck back with a vengeance. Within hours, a counter-narrative spread like wildfire. Fake articles and doctored videos painted Selena as a fraud, a rogue journalist with a personal vendetta. Public opinion, once beginning to shift, now swayed back to doubt and complacency. At the same time, Caleb found himself wandering the edges of the factory grounds, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. He felt alienated, disconnected from his family's crusade. His father and sister were consumed by their fight, while he struggled to find his place. In his aimless wandering, he didn't notice the security patrol until it was almost too late. Spotlights swept across the ground, catching his silhouette. A shout rang out, and Caleb bolted. His breath came in gasps as he weaved through the machinery, the heavy boots of guards closing in behind him. He rounded a corner and collided with a figure who grabbed him roughly. "Caleb, what the hell are you doing here?" It was Jonas Carter, his face a mask of both anger and relief. Without waiting for a reply, Jonas pulled Caleb into a narrow gap between two storage units, holding a finger to his lips. The guards passed by, their flashlights probing the darkness. Jonas waited until their voices faded before turning back to Caleb. "You have no idea how close you just came to getting caught. If they'd found you," he didn't finish the thought. The implications were clear enough. Caleb nodded silently, his face pale. The encounter left him shaken, but it also planted a seed of understanding. He had always seen his father's struggle as reckless, but now he understood the stakes more deeply than ever. At the workshop, Arlen's fear for his family deepened. His daughter's injuries and his son's close call were stark reminders of the cost of their resistance. Yet, amidst the turmoil, his resolve only hardened. He began to forge tools, not weapons of war, but instruments of self-defense. Heavy rods, reinforced shields, and other improvised items filled the workbench. Each strike of the hammer was a promise. They would not be easy prey. Jonas arrived later that evening, his face drawn. "They're stepping up patrols," he reported. "After what happened last night, they're not taking any chances." Arlen nodded, his expression grim. "Good. Let them feel cornered for a change." Jonas hesitated. "This fight, it's eating away at everyone. We need a win, Arlen. Something to remind people why we're doing this." Arlen stared at the tools on his bench, their weight heavy in his hands. "We'll give them one. But it won't come without sacrifice." The air in the town was charged with tension. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of plans and betrayals. The people were torn between hope and fear, each step forward met with a new challenge. Arlen felt the weight of every decision pressing on his shoulders, but he refused to let it crush him. For his family, for his town, and for their future, he would endure. The forge burned brightly into the night, its glow a beacon of resistance. The workshop was alive with activity, its walls echoing the sound of tools striking metal and voices murmuring plans. Arlen stood at the center, his presence commanding as he addressed the gathered crowd. It was a mix of old faces and new, seasoned workers whose hands bore the marks of years in the factory, and younger men and women who had grown weary of living in fear. The air carried the weight of their shared determination. "This fight isn't about one man," Arlen began, his voice steady but fervent. "It's about all of us, our families, our futures, our dignity. They've taken everything they can from us, but they can't take what we refuse to give. Unity is our strength, and together, we are unstoppable." The room responded with murmurs of agreement, their doubts gradually replaced by resolve. Among them, Leah stood near the front, her posture defiant despite the lingering pain in her arm. She exchanged a glance with Jonas, who nodded subtly. The plan they had been refining for days was risky, but it was their best shot. Arlen continued, outlining the details with precision. The factory's gates were heavily guarded, but their defenses had weaknesses. The plan hinged on creating a diversion to draw security forces away from the main office, giving Arlen and Jonas the opportunity to retrieve documents that would expose Forge COR's corruption once and for all. Leah raised her hand, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "We'll handle the distraction. Let me and the others create the chaos you need." Arlen hesitated, his protective instincts clashing with his respect for her capability. "It'll be dangerous." "Everything we've done so far has been dangerous," Leah replied firmly. "You trained us for this, Dad. Let us do our part." Her determination was met with scattered cheers of agreement. Arlen relented, knowing that denying her would only fuel her resolve. "Stick to the plan," he said. "No improvising unless absolutely necessary." As preparations unfolded, the group's unity became palpable. Makeshift tools of resistance, reinforced shields, slingshots, and smoke bombs were distributed among the volunteers. The younger members, led by Leah, rehearsed their roles in the distraction, while Arlen and Jonas went over the layout of the factory once more, memorizing the routes to Victor's office. The night of the operation arrived without ceremony, marked only by a tense silence as the group gathered at the edge of the factory grounds. Leah's team moved first, slipping through the shadows toward the main gate. Their task was to create enough noise and confusion to lure the guards away, but not so much that it alerted Victor prematurely. The distraction began with a controlled explosion near one of the maintenance sheds, followed by a series of smoke bombs that billowed thick clouds across the yard. Alarms blared as guards scrambled to investigate, their movements chaotic. Leah's group shouted and scattered, drawing attention away from the factory's core. Meanwhile, Arlen and Jonas navigated the back entrance, avoiding patrols as they made their way toward Victor's office. The factory, normally a cacophony of machines and labor, was eerily quiet in the corridors they traversed. Each step was measured, their breaths held as they listened for approaching footsteps. In the yard, Leah's team encountered unforeseen resistance. The guards, though disoriented, regrouped quickly and began pressing their advantage. The young fighters held their ground, using their improvised weapons to fend off the advancing security forces. The air was thick with tension and smoke, each moment stretching into eternity. Arlen and Jonas reached the office without incident, but the door was locked, as expected. Jonas pulled out a set of tools and began working on the lock, his hands steady despite the urgency. Arlen kept watch, his heart pounding in sync with the distant sounds of conflict. The lock clicked open, and they slipped inside. The office was a stark contrast to the factory floor, sleek, modern, and devoid of the grime and wear that marked the workers' spaces. Arlen's eyes scanned the room, landing on a safe built into the wall. "That's it," he whispered. Jonas approached the safe and began the painstaking process of cracking it. Arlen turned his attention to the desk, rifling through papers and files for anything incriminating. Time felt elastic, each second stretching as the sounds of battle outside grew louder. Back in the yard, Leah's team was faltering. The guards had managed to push through their defenses, and it was only through sheer determination that they held their ground. Leah barked orders, rallying her group as they retreated toward a fallback position. The tide was turning, but not in their favor. Jonas finally cracked the safe, revealing a trove of documents and a small digital drive. "This is it," he said, stuffing the contents into a bag. But as they prepared to leave, the door burst open, and Victor entered, flanked by 2 guards. His expression was a mix of fury and smug satisfaction. "Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate this?" Victor sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've always been predictable, Arlen." Arlen stepped forward, shielding Jonas. "Predictable or not, you can't stop this. The truth is out there now." Victor laughed coldly. "The truth? You think anyone cares about your so-called truth? People care about their jobs, their security. Not your crusade." Jonas, sensing an opportunity, threw a smoke bomb from his pocket. The room filled with a choking haze, and in the chaos, Arlen and Jonas pushed past the guards, their movements swift and deliberate. Victor's shouts followed them as they disappeared into the labyrinth of the factory. Outside, Leah's group was retreating when Arlen and Jonas emerged, the bag clutched tightly in Jonas's grip. The sight of the pair reinvigorated the group, and together, they made their way to safety, evading the remaining guards. The factory's alarms faded into the distance as the group regrouped at the workshop. The atmosphere was a mix of relief and exhaustion. The mission had been a success, but at a cost. Injuries were tended to in silence, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on them all. Arlen held up the bag of documents, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This is what we've fought for. The proof we need to bring them down. But this is only the beginning. We still have a fight ahead. The group nodded, their resolve unbroken despite the night's trials. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had taken a crucial step toward justice. Together, they would see it through. The factory loomed ahead, its towering smokestacks piercing the dark sky, silent and foreboding. Arlen tightened his grip on the satchel containing the incriminating documents. This was the culmination of everything they had endured, the nights of planning, the sacrifices, the constant fear. He could feel the weight of every step as he approached the factory gates, his heart a drumbeat of defiance. Inside, the factory buzzed with uneasy energy. Security teams scrambled through the corridors, their movements hurried and disorganized. Victor had doubled his guards, anticipating another attempt to undermine his authority, but he hadn't accounted for the depth of the resistance's resolve. Leah moved with precision through the shadowed alleys of the factory's perimeter. Her team followed close behind, carrying the tools they needed to execute their part of the plan. She glanced back briefly, her expression firm but tinged with the weight of responsibility. She knew what was at stake. At the heart of the factory, Victor sat in his office, his confidence tinged with paranoia. The footage of their crimes had already spread like wildfire, but he dismissed it as noise. As long as he maintained control, he could weather the storm. But the unease in his employees' eyes had begun to sow seeds of doubt, and his veneer of authority was cracking. Arlen and Jonas slipped through a side entrance, navigating the maze of corridors with practiced ease. Their footsteps were muffled against the concrete floors as they approached the heart of the factory. The documents they carried would be the final nail in Forgeor's coffin, but only if they could deliver them without incident. Leah's team reached the main power grid, the humming of the electrical systems a stark reminder of the factory's dominance. She gestured to her team, their movements synchronized as they set to work. The plan was simple: disrupt the power supply, plunge the factory into darkness, and sow chaos. It would be the signal for Arlen to confront Victor. With a final nod, Leah pulled the lever, and the factory was consumed by blackness. The hum of machinery faltered, replaced by the panicked shouts of guards and workers. Flashlights flickered to life, casting erratic beams across the corridors. In the chaos, Arlen and Jonas reached Victor's office. The door swung open with a resounding clang, and Arlen stepped inside, his presence commanding. Victor looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to anger. Well, Victor drawled, his voice a thin veil over his unease. The righteous crusader returns. What is it this time, Arlen? Another empty speech? Another failed attempt to bring me down? Arlen set the satchel on the desk and opened it, revealing the stack of documents and a small recording device. This isn't about speeches, Arlen said, his voice low and steady. This is about accountability. You've poisoned our land, exploited our people, and stolen their dignity. Tonight, tense? Victor scoffed, leaning back in his chair. You think waving a few papers around will make a difference? You're naive, Arlen. The world runs on power and I have it. You don't. Arlen pressed a button on the recorder, and Victor's previous conversations played back, his admissions of corruption and disdain for the workers crystal clear. Victor's smirk faltered as the door behind Arlen opened, revealing Celine and a group of agents. Their presence was silent but authoritative, the weight of justice descending upon the room. Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is a mistake, he hissed, his voice trembling. You don't understand. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself, Celine interrupted, her tone cutting. To a judge. As the agents moved in to arrest Victor, Arlen stepped aside, his expression unreadable. The fight wasn't over yet. Outside, the factory grounds were a scene of chaos. Guards scrambled to restore order, but Leah's team had outmaneuvered them at every turn, using the darkness to their advantage. They created diversions, disabling equipment and blocking key exits to ensure Victor couldn't escape. Jonas, stationed near one of the key junctions, noticed a group of guards closing in on Leah's position. Without hesitation, he moved to intercept them, using his knowledge of the factory's layout to create a bottleneck. He knew the risk, but his priority was buying time. "Over here!" Jonas shouted, drawing the guards' attention. He led them into a narrow corridor, his heart pounding as he barricaded the exit. The guards pounded against the metal door, their shouts echoing through the space. Jonas braced himself, knowing the inevitable was approaching. Back in the office, Victor was led away in cuffs, his protests drowned out by the chaos outside. Arlen watched him go, the weight of years of struggle pressing down on him. Leah appeared at the doorway, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling. "But Jonas, he's still out there?" Arlen's stomach dropped. He pushed past Leah, navigating the labyrinthine corridors in search of his friend. The sounds of conflict grew louder as he approached the junction where Jonas had last been seen. When he arrived, the barricade was broken, and the corridor was empty. A single guard remained, unconscious on the ground. Arlen knelt beside him, his chest tight with fear. He spotted a trail of blood leading toward an exit and followed it, his mind racing. When he emerged into the open air, the sight of Jonas's lifeless body stopped him cold. The fight had come at a cost, but there was no time to grieve. The factory gates were sealed shut, the welds glinting in the flickering light of the remaining flashlights. It was over. Forge COR's reign had ended, and the community stood together as the first rays of dawn broke through the smoke-filled sky. Arlen stood among them, his shoulders heavy with loss but his spirit unbroken. He raised a hand to the gates, a symbol of defiance turned triumph. The factory, once a monument to greed and exploitation, was now a testament to their resilience. "This is our victory," Arlen said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "But it's only the beginning. We build from here, together." The people cheered, their voices a chorus of hope and determination. Forge COR's shadow had been lifted, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. Together, they would rebuild, not just their community, but their belief in what was possible when people stood united. The city began to exhale as though it had held its breath for years. The smokestacks of the factory were silent, no longer spewing their toxic plumes into the sky. The air seemed clearer, the streets less burdened, but the work of rebuilding had only just begun. The scars left by Forge COR ran deep, etched into the land and the lives of its people. Arlen stepped into his old workshop, now a place of purpose rather than a relic of past failures. The tools, long dormant, gleamed under the dim light streaming through the windows. A group of young men and women gathered around him, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. They were the future, and he would give them the skills to shape it. He moved methodically, demonstrating the craft that had been his livelihood and, for so long, his refuge. His hands guided theirs, steady and patient. Teaching them was more than an act of instruction, it was an act of hope. As the rhythmic clanging of hammers filled the space, Arlen saw a glimmer of what the city could become, a community that worked together, unburdened by fear. Selena was in her element, tirelessly advocating for reforms. Meetings with local officials, town hall gatherings, and late-night strategy sessions had become her routine. She drafted proposals for workers' rights, environmental restoration, and corporate accountability, presenting them with the same fervor that had driven her investigative journalism. Her work was a rallying cry, a call to ensure that Forge COR's exploitation would never be repeated. One day, as Arlen left his workshop, he spotted Leah standing at the town square, surrounded by a growing crowd. She spoke with passion, her words igniting the spirit of those who listened. She was no longer just his daughter, she had become a leader in her own right, inspiring others to fight for justice in their own communities. Arlen watched her with a mixture of pride and unease. He had tried to protect her from the world's harshness, but she had chosen to confront it head-on. Her resilience reminded him of the fire he had once carried, now reignited by her determination. She caught his eye and smiled, a silent acknowledgement of their shared resolve. Meanwhile, Caleb found himself drawn back into the rhythm of family life. He had spent so long resenting his father, believing him to be a man who had given up. But seeing Arlen's sacrifices, his unyielding dedication to the city and its people, had shifted something within him. They sat together one evening in the quiet of the workshop, the weight of unspoken words between them. I didn't understand, Caleb finally said, his voice low but steady. Why you fought? Why you kept going when everything seemed hopeless? Arlen set down his tools, meeting his son's gaze. I didn't always know either. But it wasn't about winning. It was about standing for something even when the odds were against us. Caleb nodded slowly, the distance between them beginning to close. They worked side by side, forging not just metal but a bond that had long been fractured. As the city healed, so did its people. The funds from ForgeCor's dismantled assets were allocated to those who had suffered the most. Families who had lost loved ones or livelihoods received restitution, and efforts to clean the polluted rivers and lands began in earnest. The scars would remain, but they would no longer define the city. Victor, once the embodiment of unchecked greed, now sat behind bars. His trial had been swift and damning, the evidence irrefutable. The sentence was severe, a reminder that even the most powerful were not above the law. For those he had wronged, his imprisonment was a symbol of justice finally served. The factory gates, once a barrier between exploitation and freedom, had been repurposed. Welded shut and adorned with a plaque, they stood as a memorial to the struggle and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The inscription read, "In unity, we found strength. In strength, we reclaimed hope." Arlen stood before the gates one evening, the city's newfound quiet enveloping him. Leah joined him, her presence grounding him in a way few things could. "What now?" she asked, her voice carrying both weariness and curiosity. "We keep building," Arlen replied. "For ourselves, for those who come after us. This isn't the end. It's a beginning." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The world was vast, filled with challenges they couldn't yet see. But together, they would face whatever came next. The city was no longer just a place. It was a community reborn, its people bound by the shared struggle and the victories they had earned. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was theirs, a testament to what could be achieved when hope refused to die. Years had passed, but the echoes of ForgeCor's collapse lingered in the air like the final notes of a powerful symphony. The city had transformed in ways once thought impossible. Gone were the looming shadows of smokestacks and the acrid smell of pollution. In their place rose small businesses, artisan workshops, and eco-friendly enterprises that thrived on innovation and collaboration. The city's streets now buzzed with the vibrant energy of a community reborn, each corner telling a story of resilience and renewal. At the heart of the transformation stood the old factory grounds. Where once the iron gates had symbolized oppression, there now stood a memorial. It wasn't grand or ostentatious, but it commanded respect with its simplicity and solemnity. The centerpiece was a towering sculpture of intertwined hands, each detail carved to show strength and unity. The names of those who had sacrificed their lives during the struggle were etched into its base, with Jonas Carter's name among them. Flowers and mementos adorned the memorial, placed there by those who remembered the pain and triumph of the past. Leah stood at the podium before a gathered crowd, her presence commanding. The years had only sharpened her determination, and her voice carried the weight of experience and conviction. She wore a simple dress, practical yet elegant, a reflection of her nature. She had grown into her role as a leader, her words now carrying the power to inspire movements far beyond the city's borders. "This ground," she began, her voice steady and clear, "was once a place of suffering. It held us captive, not just physically but in spirit. Today, it stands as a testament to what we can achieve when we refuse to give up. When we stand together, united by a belief that no person, no community, should ever be crushed under the weight of greed." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. Leah's eyes swept over them, pausing momentarily on familiar faces. There were those who had been with her from the start, their weathered expressions telling of battles fought and victories earned. Others were new, drawn to the city by its story of redemption and hope. "This memorial is not just for those we lost," she continued. "It is for the generations to come. It is a reminder that progress is never easy, but it is always worth fighting for. We owe it to those who came before us, and we owe it to those who will come after." Leah's voice broke slightly, but she steadied herself, drawing strength from the crowd. We will not forget. We will not stop. This is only the beginning. As she stepped down from the podium, applause rippled through the air, building into a roar of appreciation and solidarity. Leah glanced at her father, who stood in the front row with Caleb beside him. Arlen's face was lined with age, but his eyes shone with pride and contentment. He gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of all they had endured and achieved. Arlen couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. The workshop he had reopened years ago was now a cornerstone of the city's revival, a place where skills were passed down and innovation flourished. Caleb, once uncertain and distant, had become his partner, their bond now unshakable. Together, they had turned the city's darkest chapter into a foundation for its brightest. As the ceremony concluded, Arlen found himself wandering toward the sculpture. He ran his fingers over the engraved names, pausing at Jonas Carter's. Memories of their shared struggles flooded back. Jonas's unwavering loyalty, his courage, and ultimately his sacrifice. Arlen whispered a silent thank you, his voice barely audible over the rustling breeze. The crowd began to disperse, but many lingered, sharing stories and laughter under the golden glow of the setting sun. Leah joined her father and brother, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and fulfillment. "You did well," Arlen said, his voice gruff but warm. Leah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We all did." Caleb clapped a hand on her shoulder. Jonas would have been proud. They stood together, a family bound not just by blood but by the shared burden of rebuilding and the shared joy of seeing their efforts bear fruit. The city stretched out before them, alive with promise. Children played in the streets, their laughter carrying on the wind, while workers and shopkeepers exchanged greetings and plans for the future. As the sun dipped lower, casting the land in hues of gold and amber, Arlen felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. The fight had cost them much, but it had also given them something priceless. A community that refused to be broken and a future that was theirs to shape. Leah broke the silence, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "This isn't just our story anymore. It's theirs now." Arlen nodded, his heart full. "And they'll make it their own." The three of them stood in quiet contemplation, the sun setting behind the memorial. It wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of something far greater. The scars of the past would remain, but they would no longer define the city or its people. Together, they had reclaimed their dignity, their hope, and their future. The golden light bathed the memorial and its visitors, a fitting tribute to a hard-won victory. The city, reborn from ashes, stood as a beacon of what could be achieved when unity and resilience triumphed over despair. The dawn of a new era had arrived, and it was filled with promise.